Hello and welcome. I'm Dave. Today we will look at how Next.js currently handles data mutations, and I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. I'll also provide a link for you to join my Discord server where you can discuss web development with other students, and you can ask questions that I can answer and receive help from other viewers too. I look forward to seeing you there. We're talking about mutating data today in Next.js, and today's starter code is available under Lesson 7 in the course resources, and it provides a fully working to-do list. If you've completed the course prerequisites listed in Lesson 1 of this video series, you've undoubtedly built a to-do list before, so I'm not going to step you through building the to-do list. Instead, we're going to specifically look at how Next.js handles the data mutations from our CRUD operations, and also how Next.js handles hard and soft navigation and what the difference is. So overall, we're focusing on understanding concepts. Now, the first note is the Next.js team is working on something new for mutating data in Next.js. And that's part of why I waited till near the end of this series to cover mutating data, but the new approach still isn't available, and I do feel like I need to cover the current approach. But just note, if you're watching this video at a future date, you should check the documentation to make sure the approach that I'm showing today hasn't changed. So on the mutating data page currently in the beta docs for Next.js, I'm going to scroll down and they're going to show a server component here, and it's part of a to-do list application. So we'll look at this first before we look at my code that's available in GitHub in the course resources, again under Lesson 11. So here we've got this server component. They have an interface for to-do. You could create a type, either one. And then they've got a get-to-dos function. Now, something we want to notice here is the cache equals no-store. Now that's important because if you want to see immediate updates in Next.js, you need to do that. And also you could do it another way. So there's two ways. The other way would be what we learned in the previous lesson, and that was setting a route segment config, and you could set your revalidate equal to 0, and it essentially does the same thing. It will make sure you are not storing those requests because you want to see those immediate updates when you update a to-do. You don't want to see a cached version held over, because then even if you checked complete, it wouldn't show that check. So this component for the list page, as we see here, is a server component that renders the list, but each item has its own client component, and that's going to allow that interactivity where you update or delete a to-do. So that's important to realize as well. So you're creating a list with a server-side rendered component, but then your actual list items will be client components, and that's what we see down here. Now my code's going to have a little bit more in it because I actually added a delete, and I've added a separate use client component that you can add a to-do with as well. So we'll just break this down first, and as we see this here, you can see they are using a router, which will cover part of how that works as well. They're also using the use transition hook and the use state hook to create an is pending and an is fetching state. And then they're kind of combining both of those into this is mutating state so they can see if either one is active. Notice here on the change handler for the input, if they're updating here with their put method, for example, that's all they do. Of course, like I said, my code's going to handle more than just that. But either way, they're setting is fetching true before the request and then false after the request. So that's handling the is fetching part. The transition is actually going to handle the router refresh here as well. So that's the use transition hook. And they're combining both of those into is mutating. And then when they render the JSX below for the list item, you can see they're using style here to just change the opacity of that item to make it kind of dim a little bit, so you might see it flicker. It's going to be fairly quick in dev mode when you're not actually reaching out to a server that's further away. But the really important part to note here is when you want to see those updates immediately in Next.js, they're calling this router refresh. And of course, they're using the useRouter hook up here to define router. And then they call router refresh. And you see that description here. It makes a new request to the server for the route. It refetches the data request and it re-renders a server component. So it's going to re-render that list and then sends the updated payload to the client. So that's what's going to happen when we call router refresh. So we see the updates in our list. So now let's look at my code in VS Code. Now we're in VS Code, and you can see I'm at the home page. A couple of things to note here. One, I'm pulling in components rather than constructing the server component itself right here that builds the list. And that's because I've also got to add to-do component that's a client component where we can add a new to-do. Also note this TS expect error line is needed, or you'll see a TypeScript error here. This was noted earlier in the series. The Next.js team is currently working with TypeScript to hopefully avoid this error in the future. This is what they currently recommend in the beta docs to avoid the error that you would see here for the to-do list. It is a legitimate component. It's just a TypeScript thing currently with Next.js. Also note that I have the route segment config up here, export const revalidate equals 0. That achieves the same thing as setting the cache equal to no store in those fetch functions. So if we go down to the lib directory here and look at the fetch to-dos function, for example, you can see I'm not passing in an options object where I set the cache to no store because I'm achieving the exact same thing by going ahead and setting that revalidate equal to 0 here with a route segment config. Now, if we look at the to-do list component that we're pulling in, we see much of what we saw in the documentation here. Very similar. I am reversing the to-dos for sorted to-dos just so the new to-do is added at the top. But other than that, it goes ahead and renders the list. And this is a server component. Now, the individual to-dos are in a to-do component. That is a client-side component because it allows for the update and delete of any individual to-do. So if we look at this component, it's much like what we saw in the documentation as well. And you can see I just added a little bit of extra code here. So I have a handle change as far as updating the to-do. Then I also down here have a handle delete. But you can see they both use a transition where router.refresh is called, so we can see that updated data once again inside of the browser immediately, and we're not seeing a older version of the data, a cached version, because then we would click update, for example, and then we would still see an empty checkbox as if we hadn't checked it. Now notice I'm also fetching data from 127.0.0.1, which is an IP address that's the equivalent of saying localhost. I just happen to use the IP address this time, and it's at port 3500. So we're going to have to start our JSON-Server where we're getting that to-do data from, as well as starting our project in dev mode. And you can see in this db.json file that you'll also find in the repository for this video, you're going to see the to-dos here that JSON-Server is going to read from inside of this file. So it will update the db.json file after you start JSON-Server. So we'll do that as well. Otherwise, let's go ahead and just start this and see how it all works in the browser. So I'm going to open up a terminal window, and I'm going to type npx JSON-Server so we can start our data server first, -w for watch, and we're telling it to watch the db.json file, -p for port, and we'll put that at 3500, then -h for host, and I'm going to put that at 127.0.0.1 and press enter. This will go ahead and start the JSON server. You can see it found the resources at to-dos. It lists the root URL as well. And if you wanted to come back to this terminal window, it will log any of the requests here as well as the request method. Now let's go ahead and open a second terminal window. Now I'm going to go ahead and type npm run dev to start this project, and after it starts up, I'm going to hold down Control and then click localhost. I'll have to scroll back up to it there. Control and click localhost 3000. Here is the to-do list. Now we should see updates right away, or when we add a new to-do. So let's do this with new to-do, and I'll press enter, and there we see our new to-do. I can update it, and we see that right away. Notice how it fades just a little bit, and that's because during the transition, then it's going ahead and dimming the opacity of the individual to-do. So when I uncheck it, we see that just kind of blink just a little bit. I can delete it as well, and we see these updates immediately. This is all working just fine when it's all on the same page. And remember, those handlers are calling that router.refresh, which gets the server-side re-render, and then we see the updated list immediately. Now, as I mentioned, this works very good when it's all on the same page. We call router.refresh, it refreshes the component, everything's good. But what if we took these same components our add component or the individual to-do component, and we put them in a different route. And if we look at VS Code, we could see that, but let me show you how it functions first before we go back to VS Code. So I'm going to go to the add route right now. I'm going to add a new to-do. Now I'll press enter. Notice we went ahead and went back to the list page because I called router.push and it sends us back here. But we don't see that new to-do I added, do we? It's missing from the list. So that's not good. What if I went to an edit page for any one of the individual to-dos? So I'll go here for, say, this write code to-do. Now I'm on an edit page for this to-do. And I'm going to click to say, okay, this is complete. Now let's go back to the home page, and I can do that by clicking Next to-dos here. Notice it's not complete here. If I go back to this individual route, it is complete. So that's out of sync too. So we've got a couple of issues to talk about. Okay, we're back in VS Code, and as noted before, I have the route segment config here, revalidate equals 0, and we see those updates immediately as long as we're doing them on the same page. But when we go to either one of these routes, either the add, here's our page TSX for that, and it just pulls in that add to do component that's the same as the home page essentially, where it pulled in the add to do component. And there's no difference there other than that. But let's also look at the edit route that pulls in an ID here. And if we look at this, it also has the revalidate here set equal to 0. And then, of course, it pulls in this to do. So this is the same as when we created our list with the to-do list that pulled in the to-do, but we're not getting the same result. And if we look at the to-do up here at the top and come down, what we will notice, I believe, let's find it here in the transition. Here is the router refresh for the delete, and then here is the router refresh for the update. So it's calling router refresh. But what's happening is we're not on the same route. So when we call the router refresh and we're on the same page, then we see the update in the list. But when we call it on this separate route, we're not seeing it in the list. And we really need to go ahead and look at the docs to see why this is happening. We're back in the docs. I'm back at the mutating data page, and we see here it says after mutating external data, you can use router refresh to refresh the current route. And then it says from the root layout down, but that doesn't mean it's going to go to another route. Emphasis here on the current route. So that's one thing to note. Now let's go ahead and look up useRouter itself. So we'll find that here in the beta docs. And now that we've found useRouter, let's scroll down to where it talks about useRouter a little bit more. And under the good to know, this is also something we want to highlight here. The push and replace methods will perform a soft navigation if the new route has been prefetched and either doesn't include dynamic segments or has the same parameters as the current route. So that's important to note because we were using a push when we added that new to-do, and we noticed that it was a soft navigation. It wasn't a hard navigation, or we would have seen the new to-do. And here it says, if the new route has been prefetched and either doesn't include dynamic segments or the same dynamic parameters as the current route. Well, it probably was prefetched and it doesn't include any dynamic segments. So one thing we can do in our code is set prefetch to false. Let's go back to VS Code and see how that works. Okay, I am back in VS Code. Now we want to set prefetch to false, and that was in our nav bar because we clicked on the name. It said next to dos here that we have inside of our header. So let's go ahead and just set the prefetch equal to false on this link and save. Now we'll go back to our browser and see if we get the same behavior. Okay, I'm back in the browser and I'm going to reload the application here with a hard reload just to make sure we have that new behavior. And so I'm going to delete the new to-do that showed up as well. And now we can see write code was already checked as completed. And so now I'll uncheck that. So now we have the fresh app here once again. I can refresh with a hard refresh again just to make sure. Now we already put that prefetch equal to false for this link. So let's go to the add page. Now let's add, once again, let's just say, hey, as our new to-do and submit. Notice it shows up right away. So what we did was not prefetch the next to-dos link on the render for that individual ad page. And by not prefetching the link, it didn't do a soft navigation. So now we need to discuss the difference between soft and hard navigation and what's happening. Okay, I'm back in the beta docs under linking and navigating, and we can see hard navigation and soft navigation defined. So here it says for hard navigation, on navigation, the cache is invalidated and the server refetches data and re-renders changed segments. So that's what we really want to see that new updated to do, is the hard navigation, because it says the cache is invalidated. Now this is where it gets complex, because we spend so much time talking about server components and we don't really talk much at all about a client-side cache, but Next.js does have one, and you see that on soft navigation. You see what's cached on the client side, and that's not what we want. But you need to realize that a client-side cache does exist, even though we don't spend much time talking about it. Here for soft navigation, it says the cache for changed elements is reused if it exists, and no new requests are made to the server for data. That means it's all client-side. That's a client-side cache. But can we avoid all the issues by setting prefetch to false? I'm not so sure. Let's go back to the application here in our browser, and let's go to the edit page for our hey to-do, and let's see if we update the to-do, say it's completed. Now let's go back to the main page. It says it's completed. We see that update. That's great. Now let's say it's not completed. Now let's go back to the edit page. It's still completed. Something's still out of sync, and that's not working. The problem we have is that all of these links that we have for the to-dos are not set to prefetch. So that could also be a solution, but do you really want to set every link in your application prefetch equal to false? Maybe not, but we might as well see if it works. So let's go back to VS Code. Okay, I'm in VS Code, and we need to look at the to-do component because that's where the link is. And let's look at the link that we have as we create each item. And let's find it down here somewhere. Oh, these are the buttons, and that's the input. Here's the link right here. I'm going to press Alt-Z just to wrap any code that we need to. And let's set prefetch equal to false in this link as well, which will apply to every to-do list component. And now let's go back to the browser once again. I'm back in the browser. I'm going to do a hard refresh here just to get everything updated, just to make sure. And now let's go ahead and click this hey as it's completed. And now let's go to the edit page. It did work. So it says it's completed. So we've figured out one way to solve this problem when we're trying to keep things in sync between page routes, and that is to set prefetch to false on the navigation links. But now let me use the back button and make sure it stays the same way, because that should also be a soft navigation, right? So I've unchecked hey. It is not complete. Now let's go back. Hey is still checked if I use the back button. We still have a problem. Unchecked. Now let's go back. Still checked. Unchecked. Let's use a next link. Now it's unchecked. But that doesn't solve the problem for the back button. So there's a better way, or at least there needs to be. Let's look at what else I've found. I'm now on GitHub under issues for Next.js, and somebody posted an issue that says next link is choosing soft navigation for dynamic routes. That's not the exact issue that we're talking about, but we found this discussion that applies all the same. Now this is Tim from the Next.js team, and he says we're reworking the client-side router caching behavior. We'll share more soon. But he does share more just down here, just a little bit further. So I'll scroll back down to his next post. And here he says router.refresh on Canary invalidates the entire router cache. And there we're talking about that client-side cache. So he says, for now, using router refresh is fine, just as a previous post said. So what he's saying is if we use router refresh in the Canary release, which means the very latest release that we would have to install, and it's not even an official release yet. Canary can change several times per day even. But if we go ahead and install Canary, we should be able to call router refresh, and this behavior that we're currently seeing will change. Let's head back to VS Code. Okay, I'm back in VS Code, and I'm going to take the prefetch equals false out of these to-do links. and save that file. I'm also going to go back into the nav bar and take the prefetch equals false out of the header as well. So we've eliminated those, and we're going to still see if we can get the behavior that we want. I'm going to open up the terminal window, and I'm going to go ahead and stop the application. And now let's look at the package JSON real quick. I'll close the terminal for a second. Let's see what version we're currently using. I was using 13.2.4. The current release of the beta version is 13.3 something, but Canary would be even newer than that. As I said, any updates come out sometimes more than once daily. So what you can do is open your terminal window, type npm I for install, then say next at Canary. And now this is kind of hit and miss. There could be other bugs. So let's see what happens here after we install Canary. Okay, Canary is installed. Let's close the terminal window for a second and look. And we have 13.3.2-canary.6. Now, I don't know if it's going to work in this version or not because this has changed just since yesterday. It may have even changed since earlier today, but I do know a Canary version where the behavior is working. So let's just try this new one first. I'll open the terminal again and I'll see if we can even start our app in dev mode. Sometimes that doesn't work. You never know with Canary. So it's currently working. Let's go ahead and go back to the browser. Okay, I'm back in the browser. I'm going to do another hard refresh because now we're using a new version of Next.js, and we'll see if everything works as expected now. Remember, we took those prefetch equals false attributes out of the links, so we're no longer using that solution. Let's see if I can check this as it's completed. Now let's go ahead and go to the edit page. It's completed there too. Remember, we don't have prefetch equals false anymore. This is the behavior we want, and we can tell the Next.js team is working on that. Let's uncheck it. I'll go ahead and use this next link. We went back to the home page and it's unchecked. Very nice. Let's go ahead and check it again. Let's go back to the edit page. Now let's use the back button after we uncheck it. And it remains unchecked. This is exactly what we want. So I think the Next.js team is headed in the right direction. This is not in a release yet. It's currently only available in the Canary version, which you would never use in production. You wouldn't even really want to use the beta version yet, as I've had several ask me, but it's good to learn this stuff now and see that Next.js is headed in the right direction. Now, if you're watching this in the future, this could all be standard. It could be out of beta even. So it's good to know all of this. And of course, we're going to work on deploying an application before this Next.js series is over. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.